At 8 a.m. on the morning of the 18th of September, 1953, Albert Pierpoint, England's most prolific and go-to hangman of the 20th century, together with his assistant, Robert Stewart, waited patiently in the execution chamber of Strangeways Prison in Manchester for his next customer, a 46-year-old woman by the name of Louisa Merrifield. Incredibly, she'd been able to convict herself by her own gossiping, which swayed the jury, and she had talked herself into her own hanging for a crime committed in Blackpool. When she was brought to the scaffold, she refused to remove her glasses when requested. Pierpoint, having fulfilled his commitments in dispatching the convicted criminal, later remarked that the hanging went very well, adding that she said goodbye to the death cell officers and that it was much better than he had imagined. Louisa was born in Wigan in Lancashire in 1906 into a coal mining family. Many lived in dilapidated, cramped, vermin-infested back-to-back houses, often overcrowded, without proper sanitation. Toilets were frequently outdoors, shared by dozens of neighbours, and often overflowing, disease-living areas. Although water access was improving, many still relied on a single pump in the street, and she received little formal education. At the time of her death, she had been married 3 times, the first to Joseph Ellison in 1931, with whom she had 6 children, 2 of whom died in infancy. She lost the custody of all 4 of her surviving 2 daughters and 2 sons when she was sent to prison for 84 days in 1946, having been found guilty of ration book fraud and refusing to pay the £10 fine. Her husband died in 1949, aged 44, of hepatitis. A year later, she subsequently married 78-year-old Richard Weston during February 1950. He died 10 weeks later of a heart attack. Evidently not to be deterred by this setback, in August 1950, she married her 3rd husband, 67-year-old widower Alfred Merrifield, whose first wife, Alice, had died in 1949. He had abandoned her and their 10 children in 1928. 2 of her husbands were older men, and she had been married 3 times in 10 months, having been widowed twice. From 1950 up to the time of the murder, Merrifield had some 20 jobs, working as a domestic helper and a housekeeper. She had been frequently fired or forced to leave, owing to her poor work-shy attitude, her alleged pilfering, and fondness of rum. In mid-March 1953, Louisa and Alfred have a stroke of luck, as they were employed as a housekeeper, handyman, and live-in companion to 79-year-old Sarah Ann Ricketts, who lived in her bungalow at 339 Devonshire Road in Blackpool. She was a widow with an interesting backstory. It is a curious fact that Mrs. Ricketts had been married twice, and both her husbands committed suicide in the bungalow. The first, John Green, aged 70, gassed himself in the cooker oven on the 1st of November 1942. Just 4 years later, her second husband, 77-year-old William Ricketts, also gassed himself in exactly the same way on the 1st of August 1946. Ricketts, a retired farmer, left an estate valued at £4,493. Apart from the coincidence that she had 2 husbands who committed suicide using exactly the same method in her home, the fact that these deaths were just 4 years apart seems extraordinary. Mrs. Ricketts could be truculent, willful, manipulative, and even selfish. She was of slight build, being 4 foot 11 inches tall, and was described as a difficult, grouchy woman with a short temper. She had a habit of changing her will whenever a beneficiary annoyed or upset her. Soon after the Merrifields took up their jobs, Ricketts was complaining about their lack of care towards her, did not feed her enough, and that they were spending a lot of her money in the local pubs, where Louisa drank excessively and habitually became severely inebriated. Louisa began to brag at a bus stop to a Mrs. Brewer that Mrs. Ricketts was dead and had left her the bungalow, even though the elderly woman was still very much alive. It became apparent to Louisa that her elderly husband would not be able to support her financially for much longer. By late March, she had talked Mrs. Ricketts into writing a will that left the bungalow to her, which was valued between £3,000 and £4,000. When Alfred found out about the will, that he was not included, he complained bitterly to his wife, who acquiesced and consequently assigned half of the property. Louisa could not resist boasting, and on the 25th of March, she gleefully told her friend that she had a bit of luck, as her employer had died and left her a bungalow worth £3,000. She even wrote to a former boss, "I've got a nice little job nursing an old lady, and she's left me a lovely little bungalow. So, you see, it all comes right in the end." Even strangers weren't spared. To a startled woman at a bus queue, she blurted out that Mrs. Ricketts was dead the day before it actually happened, adding lurid details about her husband and employer. "If this goes on, I'll poison him and the old biddy as well. She was leaving the bungalow between me and my husband, but he's so greedy, he wants it all on his own." On the 9th of April, Louisa convinced Dr. Yule, Mrs. Ricketts' doctor, to certify that Ricketts was mentally competent enough to make a new will. He later said, "Louisa said the reason why she wanted me to go was that the old lady might die at any minute with a stroke or a disease, and she wanted to keep herself all right with the relatives." On the 13th of April, Dr. Yule's partner, Dr. Wood, was called out by Louisa, who claimed that Ricketts was seriously ill, whereas Wood diagnosed mild bronchitis. He would later testify at Merrifield's trial. "I remonstrated with Mrs. Merrifield for calling me out, as I thought, under false pretences. She again said she was afraid of something happening during the night, and mentioned something about a will. Although this evidence could be seen as only circumstantial, it could lead to the conclusion that Merrifield was already trying to prove that the elderly Mrs. Ricketts was dying of natural causes. One of the elderly lady's odd eating habits was that she enjoyed jam straight from the jar with a spoon, washed down with either rum or a bottle of beer. Louisa had added rhodine to the jam, a phosphorus-based rat poison, which she had purchased at a local chemist's. On the 12th of April, Louisa told her friend Jessie Brewer that she had to return home to lay out an old woman. On Brewer's inquiry as to who had died, Merrifield said, "She's not dead yet, but she soon will be." Ricketts died on the evening of the 14th of April, but the doctor was not called until the next morning. She claimed that the elderly woman was clearly dead, and she had not wished to call the doctor out late at night. The local Salvation Army band was asked to stand outside the bungalow, playing "Abide With Me." She also insisted for Ricketts to be quickly cremated, and did not want the old lady's family to know of her sudden death. Later, funeral director George Jackson confirmed this, saying that Louisa and her husband did not want Ricketts' two daughters to know she was dead or have anything to do with the funeral. Reading of the death in the local newspaper, Mrs. Brewer reported her chance conversation at a bus queue to the police about when Louisa had blurted out that Mrs. Ricketts was dead, a day before it actually happened. They immediately ordered a post-mortem, which reported that Ricketts had died of phosphorus poisoning, an ingredient of rat poison. When the police searched the bungalow, they didn't find any, but did find a teaspoon in Louisa's handbag, coated with rum and phosphorus. Inquiries at a local chemist revealed that Louisa had recently purchased rat poison and was legally required to sign the poison register for the product. She was arrested on the 30th of April, just 16 days after her employer's death. Alfred soon followed. Both were jointly charged with murder before being committed to the Manchester Assizes for trial, which took place between the 20th and the 31st of July, 1953. Louisa even had a photograph on the front page of newspapers as she arrived at court every day, smiling and waving to the photographers and crowds outside the court. The Merrifields pleaded not guilty. The first act of the defence was to object to two women being included as jurors, an objection that was successful. Dr. Yule was one of the first witnesses. Having seen Sarah Ricketts 4 days before her death, he said that he had found the demise of the 79-year-old troubling. He had decided not to issue a death certificate and instead reported the death to the coroner's office. Several witnesses told the court of Louisa Merrifield's certainty that her employer would soon be dead. Veronica King, who lived on Yorkshire Street, said Louisa told her, "I will go and lay out the old lady." This prompted Mrs. King to ask if someone had died, to which Louisa said, "She's not dead yet, but she soon will be." This was 2 days before Mrs. Ricketts died. During the trial, the largely deaf Alfred Merrifield appeared to be confused by the proceedings, while his wife, who was confident that she would be acquitted, seemed to be reveling in the attention. 3 doctors testified against her, as did several of her friends, who recalled her boasts of an inheritance. A letter to one of her previous employers about the inheritance was also produced. It was dated 2 weeks before Mrs. Ricketts had actually died. Merrifield's friend, Jessie Brewer, testified that 3 days before the death, Merrifield had told her, "We're landed. We went to live with an old lady, and she died, and she's left me a bungalow worth £4,000. It was all left to me until that old idiot got talking to her, and then it was left to us jointly. I made everything all right. It cost me £2 2 to get a doctor to prove she was in her right mind." Under cross-examination, Brewer was adamant that the conversation had placed the death of Ricketts in the past tense. The jury had to decide whether the Merrifields, together or separately, administered the poison. Second, they had to decide whether there was an intention to kill. Finally, was it by poisoning? If the jury answered yes to these questions, they must find the Merrifields guilty, or one of them innocent. The judge advised the jury to rely on their own common sense. The question of poison was a crunch issue in the case. Home Office pathologist Dr. George Manning stated that Mrs. Ricketts' liver was discoloured, indicating phosphorus poisoning. Her heart had probably given up after receiving a fatal dose, or doses, during the night before she died. The rat poison would have had a bad taste, but Dr. Manning said that Mrs. Ricketts' favourite treat of eating jam would have disguised this. The defence countered that she died from natural causes, even though phosphorus was found in her body. The evidence against the Merrifields was largely circumstantial, but what little there was had been exacerbated by Louisa's actions and her boasts of an inheritance, while Ricketts was still living. It had been her who called out the doctor to verify that Ricketts was well enough to sign a new will, and it was her who had called her doctor out, claiming Ricketts was near death. when she was actually just unwell. Her actions were used to demonstrate her guilt, but Alfred's innocence. In fact, he had the same motives and opportunities as his wife. Mrs. Ricketts had asked Alfred to call the solicitor because she wanted to alter her will again, sounding very much as though she was going to cut the Merrifields out of it. Alfred suddenly changed his mind about going into town for her, saying it was too far for him to walk at the moment. He had also refused the doctor admittance to attend the ailing Ricketts while he ate his lunch. The next day, she was dead. The jury took 6 hours to reach its verdict. It was Louisa's own gossiping that swayed them, and she had condemned herself out of her own mouth. The clerk asked the foreman, in regard to Louisa Merrifield, do you find her guilty or not guilty of murder? Guilty, the foreman replied, but could not reach a verdict on Alfred. The judge said, you have been convicted on plain evidence as a wicked and cruel murderer as I have ever heard tell of. She was sentenced to death by hanging. It was directed that Alfred be retried at Manchester Assizes. In the event, the Attorney General decided not to go on with a prosecution against him, and he was released from prison on the 6th of August. Louisa was originally sentenced to be hanged on the 18th of August, but she appealed against her verdict, which was dismissed, and a reprieve turned down. Awaiting the hangman must have been bleak, not helped by knowing that Alfred was free and living in the bungalow he had inherited. Even when he visited her in prison, the old animosity erupted again. The prison governor alerted the Home Office of a shouting match between them on the 15th of August. In his telegram, he informed, this afternoon, whilst Mr. Merrifield was visiting his wife, there was a scene during which Mrs. Merrifield shouted at her husband, get out of this wretched prison. I never want to see you again. Days before her execution, Louisa and Alfred were reconciled when she was visited in a cell by him, and she said, goodbye, Alfie. Look after yourself, and God bless. The sentence of death was concluded at Strangeways Prison on the morning of the 18th of September. A crowd of several hundred gathered outside to read the official notice of her death. She was the fourth and final woman to be executed at the Manchester prison. In her will, she left £45, 13 shillings and 9pence to her son Oswald, a brickworks labourer. Years later, questions still remain unanswered. Firstly, was Louisa Merrifield a serial killer? She had bragged to Gertrude Thomas about killing her second husband, Richard Weston. My last husband was 80, so it didn't take much to polish him off. He had died 2 months after they wed, in 1950, cause of death being given as a heart attack. Louisa had claimed to have brought this on by giving him a shock. Richard Weston's son, Daniel, certainly had his suspicions. After his father's death, he discovered that his father's bank account had been drained completely of its deposits. When he asked Louisa, whom he had only met on the occasion of his father's funeral, what had happened to Mr. Weston's savings, she replied, he has been very kind to me. There is, of course, no proof that she murdered a previous husband or husbands, or experimented in the use of poisons on other people. That she appeared to sometimes carry rat poison in her bag and made loose threats about poisoning, Alfred and other people must again inevitably raise further suspicions about her. Secondly, how did Alfred escape the same guilty verdict as his wife? He was described by the defence barrister as a tragic simpleton, and his protest that he could not hear what was being said in court probably gave the impression that he was a bumbling old dodderer, and the judge called him somewhat foolish. So, Was the all-male jury taken in by a witless old man's act, assessing him less harshly than his wife? More damning was the fact that he was a co-beneficiary of the will. He stood to inherit the bungalow and money alongside his wife. Louisa certainly did not take him for a fool, telling a stranger at a bus stop, Elizabeth Barraclough, that Alfred was trying to get Mrs. Ricketts to make him sole beneficiary. Whether she really believed that or not, the incident demonstrates that she felt Alfred was sharp enough to do her out of her share, given the chance. Now that his wife was out of the way, Alfred continued to live at the bungalow, having secured the inheritance from his deceased employer. He was seen as an unusual character who was house-proud and did not seem disturbed that it was the place where Mrs. Ricketts had died. With the will contested by Mrs. Ricketts' daughters for a share of the inheritance, he eventually settled for 1/6 of it in 1956. He then moved into a caravan and became a regular attraction at Blackpool's Golden Mile beachfront sideshows, billed as the murderess's husband, talking about his wife and the murder of Mrs. Ricketts. He died on the 24th of June 1962 at the age of 79. He always maintained that he was unaware of his wife's activities, that she would have poisoned him next for his share of the bungalow.